Note: the following was originally found on an internet forum. The author is unknown.
Forward. With regard to my experiences of the last year, I've decided to summarize my unusual experiences of September 2020 in retrospect, to hopefully find some kind of peace. My documentation follows. 2nd of September. It all started here. The weather was pretty stormy at the time. Back at the beginning of September it wasn't particularly extreme though. I didn't have much to do then. Social life was limited, and I had quickly made a habit of spending my time either on internet forums or in the forest near my apartment. There really wasn't much going on then, until the second day of the new month, because after I had trekked out of the forest again, crossed the streets back to my apartment and finally went to bed, I had a strange dream. Well, I don't know how strange it was back then, but it was strange enough to stick in my mind more precisely than usual, and looking back, I can only guess that this was the first sign of something abnormal. To be brief, I dreamt of the forest. The same forest whose treetops I could see through the window of my bedroom. It was dark, but I could make out my surroundings as if it were the brightest day. I remember moving through one of the many paths, past trees and bushes that were too close together for me to ever see where I was. The forest was extremely huge, and I hadn't even barely explored every path back then. I moved along a winding route, even past a large pond on the side of the path, until I finally reached a dead end. Here, where the trees were much thinner, I looked around as if searching for something, before I saw something between the many plants. I can't exactly remember that first dream, but what I roughly saw was a small building, a cube of red brick. It was only a few meters from the edge of the path and was painted. Whether with graffiti or something else I couldn't tell. Mostly patterns of lines and circles. I have to mention, the dream was vivid, extremely vivid, and when I saw the little hut with its crooked roof, I could feel something. A sensation that I knew well. It was a heartbeat. My own heart seemed to be beating faster than I could have ever imagined. It felt like I was seeing something more frightening than a single mind could handle. It was a primitive fear, older than the strongest fear of the unknown, and even the indomitable fear of death. And then I woke up, on my bed, heart pounding and drenched in sweat. I already thought back then that the dream was special, but I wrote it off for the time being. 7th of September. The dream was special, but it wasn't the exception, it was the rule. On the nights that followed the second, the whole show repeated. Every night I would follow that one path in the forest anew, until I reached the end and found the hut. More impressions also became clear from night to night. After one night I was able to take my own steps on the forest floor. They were rushed and caused a splashing because the ground was apparently soaked, as if the monsoon had passed over my dream forest. After another I could hear and see the rain itself. Every night I would repeatedly wake up in a rush, feeling like I was running a marathon. I had to do something, talk to someone. So I did the only thing imaginable. I told strangers on the internet. As I mentioned, I regularly attended online forums, so naturally, I decided to share my own story there. I did so on September 6th, and on September 6th, I got the answer that turned the extraordinary dream into a real horror story. A user shared my experience. In fact, a complete stranger who, it turns out, also lived in my general area, had, according to him, exactly the same dream. Of course, he didn't see any relation to reality, as he didn't know my forest, which only made it stranger that he dreamt about it. At first, I was immediately ready to label him a liar. Obviously, he had only read about my story and was trying to scare me. But I soon had to doubt that. After just another sleepless night, 3 other people from the same area wrote to me and told me how they had experienced exactly the same dreams. None of them knew about the others, and until then they thought they were isolated cases. I asked them all personally when they first had these dreams, and was stunned when they all replied with September 2nd. What kind of Call of Cthulhu shit was this? That evening, despite having an uneasy feeling, I went back to the forest and even took a few photos before I turned back. The weather had worsened that week, and the rain was particularly heavy on the 7th, and increased by the afternoon. But I went out anyway. I don't know why, but I wasn't ready to admit that I was looking for the place in my dream. 11th of September. After another dream, the weather was almost as raging in real life as it was in those vivid nocturnal fancies. But I wasn't the only one looking into the dreams. The other 4 people from around here had also decided together to investigate the source of the dreams, and they wanted me to help them, since I mentioned in my story that I knew the forest from the dreams. And on September 9th, after the most recent dream, my interest, or fear, was kindled enough to join them. So we talked over the internet and decided that I would look deeper into my forest, hopefully to find the place that wouldn't leave all of our heads. So, on the afternoon of the 11th, I went back to the forest, where I spent hours. I reached my earlier turning point and stepped into the unknown. The further I went into the forest, the heavier the rain seemed to get. 100 minutes after entering new territory, it was an absolute storm. But I kept going anyway, driven by curiosity about what had barely let me sleep for 9 nights. I could keep my tiredness at bay, but I found little. I followed every broad path and every narrow passage until I reached a dead end, turned back and looked for the next. The forest grew thicker and the rain grew louder, but nothing brought back memories. I kept going though, partly because the thick trees above my head kept me from most of the rain, but there was hope. The thick vegetation around me gave me the slightest sense of acquaintance, and I knew that I was approaching something. Eventually, when my legs were exhausted, my clothes soaked, and the sun was almost below the horizon, I reached a wider part of the path I was currently following. It seemed to extend even further, where it was alternately wider and narrower, and more small clearings opened up. I was ready to turn back. The rain was heavier than ever, and I had no reason to believe that I would find anything else. I looked once into the distance of the path, the end of which could not be seen, and something struck me. It wasn't direct, it was more of an impression, something that struck my memory. The path seemed to deform in the far distance. It was less straight, full of curves. It reminded me of the path of my dream. At that very moment there was distant thunder, and I immediately decided to turn back, to return with my bike the next day and look further. I took one last picture and made my way back. It was only when I got home after nightfall and looked over my photos that I noticed something that I had captured on this last picture. I sent the other dreamers an enhanced version that night, and promised them to return immediately the next day. Whereupon I lay down to sleep, expecting another vivid dream.